legacies not only of the Ottoman Empire, but also of the Habsburg Empire, the Romanov Empire, the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Multiple empires exist simultaneously and yet understood in very different ways. And so I came to this sort of almost revelation that there was this wide field of study related to how those empires of the past continue to inspire thought and action and emotion in the present. We are multiple social, scientific, and humanistic disciplines all focused together on this common challenge of comprehending how particularly imperial history and legacy resonates today in political, social, and cultural life. We are based here in Rijeka, in a port city, as the key former port city of the Hungarian half of the Habsburg Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. The university also provides a very welcome home for us in its broad perspective on cultural studies within which the project fits. So Rijeka, for that reason especially, seemed like a fitting home for the project. Just as a port city always looks out to the horizons on the sea, but also in the hinterland, our project is looking out to these horizons, and it's from Rijeka that we do so, and I think it's a good place from which to do so. The model of persons, places, and things is both a microscope and a telescope, if you will. So the first moment is microscopic, zooming in on aspects of these particular post-imperial sites or persons or objects that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye, at least to the sort of casual glance. So that microscopic moment, but then the second moment, of course, is to use those microscopic details to telescope outward and to tell stories about the world we live in today in relationship to the empires of the past.
The basic idea of my work was to do a micro-history of one particular street corner here in Sarajevo. And this is the intersection here at the Latin Bridge, Latinska Ćuprija. And then, of course, the primary reason why I chose this particular corner is this is the corner where the assassination occurred. Over here, we actually have some items directly related to the assassination. Here we have the official arrest record of Gavrilo Princip, as well as some of the firearms used by the assassins. There were several, only Gavrilo Princip was the one who fired.
So one thing I find really interesting here is that we have on the one hand these relics from Princip, the assassin. On the other hand, you have right behind us Sophie and Franz Ferdinand recreated as the sort of centerpiece. In some ways, I mean, you mentioned compromise before. It seems as though there's an attempt to provide every possible interpretation of this event, and yet still these memories are alive today in the city, are they not?
Oh, very much so. Šta mislite o atentatu Gavrila Principa na Franza Ferdinanda?
Mislim da je bilo vrijeme tako da se desi neki veliki incident pa da krene rat.
Tako da je taj prvi svjetski rat Gavrilo Princip, legenda kaže da je tamo htio da bježi.
Sad se to smatrao kao terorizam.
Nekoga pominje kao herojom, nekog kao teroristom.
Nije, on je bio heroj.
Već je bio kraj Austro-Ugarske, znate. Države bi se odvojile, ko što se i odvojile i to je tako bilo. Ne može ništa dugo trajati.
I'm mostly interested in places, and with a place you have different narratives, different people intersecting. Really, by limiting the area you're looking at, you're kind of able to tell a lot more than if you're telling a much grander picture, because you can focus on details. I'm not so interested in a street corner. I don't think that's really significant for a lot of people, but rather to look at the street corner and through it see the entire world, to see the intersections of empire. You have the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary really converging at this point and looking at really over the course of several centuries what transpired here, especially through language and cultural change. And you can see the diversity captured on the street corner and the dynamics of it over time. It's overwhelming in its way. I can imagine everyone who subsequently stayed here had that feeling of this is where the Archduke and his wife passed away, and with it, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was soon heard around the world. I mean, this was not just a moment of local significance. This truly was a moment of world significance, and it actually happened in this spot. It's a fascinating building in its own right. This building had many purposes over time, but primarily as a residence, starting in the Ottoman period, and then during the Austro-Hungarian period, of course, this became the seat of the government as well. This was the most natural place for them to be taken, right across the river from where the assassination occurred.
After visiting the very place, the very site of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie in Sarajevo, we're here now in Vienna at the Military History Museum, where we find a recreated street corner, including the original car in which they were driving, some of the weapons that were used in the assassination, and perhaps most dramatically, the uniform that Franz Ferdinand was wearing, where you can still see the torn bullet hole and some of the remains of his blood. The Revenant project is committed to an understanding of these imperial pasts through the objects, the places, the persons that continue to embody them. We're here in Vienna specifically to talk about one really quite provocative object, the Pumarin bell, which was ostensibly forged from the Ottoman cannonballs. So this object, which was once a weapon aimed against the city, has now been transfigured into part of the worship, part of the collective life of Viennese residents, and in some sense has become emblematic for the city, for the country. And it's that transfiguration which requires both selective memory and selective amnesia, selective forgetting, that I think is really at the heart of what we do for Revenant.
And when we now sit here, it's like you can see exactly where the tents had been from the Ottoman army and their camps. But I mean, it's really something symbolic that you put it up where you were able to watch this over a long time, where people shot at you. You were able to see, you know, the fog coming out of the cannons and the artillery and so on. And then you built this bell out of this.
It was once an object of war, it was once a threat, it was once outside. We brought it right to the center. It's now at the center of the city. It's in some sense become ours. But then in becoming ours, it actually creates who we are. It creates that we in a way.
I mean, war always means massive destruction and lots of losses. People lose their lives, their homes, and somehow every country afterwards, regardless if they are the victors or the ones who lost, they have to make some kind of sense of it, tell the people why it was worth.
It's particularly interesting that its history is then in some sense reignited with the Second World War. So it has its origins in the borderland wars of the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire, and then it becomes a symbol for, in some sense, the reconstitution of the Austrian people after the threat of the Third Reich, which also, of course, was taken up in Austria in many ways. So, I mean, it's a complicated object.
It's something like this making sense of. It's always a mixture of how historians approach historic topics, how politicians then take up ideas, and also something like what people thought about it to make sense of out of it. I soon figured out that history can't be just showing the truth, the historic truth of something. So what I usually do when I do research is like to find as many as sources as possible and to bring them all together and tell people, look, here was this group interested in that and this. So to show that it was not black and white. When I first approach an archive for my master's thesis, it's like, here it's written how it was. And then you just go for the content, what they write, I mean, from the content point of view. But it's much more interesting who wrote it, why was it written, why was it exactly written at that time, why was it addressed to this person. So all these, what I usually sum up as context, but this context is often very much more of interest than what is actually written there. It's how and why people wrote exactly this at that time.
Now we're thinking about post-imperial persons, how we understand the empires through different people. I think it's important not to simply think about the empires and to sort of foster this cultural memory through these iconic figures, whether it be Suleiman or Hurrem Sultan or even Abdulhamid. Why Osman Hamdi Bey is a perfect figure for understanding kind of the ambivalences of the empire.
Well, he's perfect because he's like the embodiment of one facet of Ottoman modernization, westernization in the 19th century. He is the white Ottoman par excellence. He is, Sherif Mardin used to talk about super westernized individuals.
Right, right.
He is a super westernized individual whose audience is mostly the West. So he's a little bit removed from his own environment. He is practicing an art that is very Western. He is an Orientalist painter.
Right.
So he's very problematic, ambiguous if you want. To the average Turk, Osman Hamdi is now more or less a known figure. And through his painting, and through one particular painting, because it made the news. When you say $3.5 million, everybody listens. And Osman Hamdi made it into the greater public thanks to the sale of one of his paintings in the 1990s. So if you ask people in the street, the first reaction is going to be, oh, he's the painter of the tortoise charmer. He was basically painting like a Westerner. He was Orientalizing, otherizing, whatever, you know.
He was studying with Western Orientalist painters.
Yes, I mean, he was strongly inspired. He studied with Boulanger, but he was also very much inspired, although he didn't work with him, by Jérôme. And he doesn't talk about Orientalism. He talks about painting like a bourgeois painter. You know, he would never have been an impressionist. I mean, he's not.
Right, right. That would have been
his
far
dream,
too radical.
His dream. But I think he was pushed into that slot. His father was Grand Vizier. He sends him to Baghdad. Paris, 1868, Baghdad, 1869. He didn't want to come back from Paris. I mean, the first frustration is coming back from Paris. And Paris in the 1860s is, you know, Paris of Napoleon III. It's Paris, ville de splendeur, ville de lumière. It's the apotheosis of Paris. And then Baghdad, the most oriental, you might say, area of the Ottoman Empire. That makes Osman Hamdi. And in 1873, he's sent to Vienna as the commissioner for the Ottoman section at the Vienna exhibition. It's a big grand bazaar for the benefit of the Viennese public. And he's in charge of that. And that's when there's this famous photograph of him wearing one of the costumes that are exhibited, wearing it in a photograph studio in Vienna. That's him. So that's where he has this double image of, he's a bourgeois. He's a very Gallicized, very French bourgeois, and he enjoys, he's an Oriental drag queen. He likes impersonating the Orient, and he knows that there is something in the Orient that can sell.
The dominant sort of cultivated collective memory of the Ottomans nowadays does focus on the golden age of the 16th century, it seems to me. And yet the framework through which that is understood is entirely a legacy of that late 19th and early 20th century period. And I think that's what comes through so much in the story you tell about Osman Hamdi Bey.
Obviously, I mean, some people will tell you, oh, he's not really Orientalist because there's no sex, there's no violence. But Orientalism is not just about sex and violence. I mean, it's something that is much more subtle. And he did that. He constructed an imaginary Orient that was convincing enough for Western audiences because he had an Oriental signature. There are two options. Hamdi is going to be the good guy, the man who founded the archaeological museum, who protected the heritage and whatever, and who was a major intellectual, a witness of the Orient, and somebody who has presented a very positive vision of the Orient, mosques and turbes, mausolea and whatever to the west. The alternative is, oh, he was a collaborator of the West, he was Orientalist, and he gave away much of the heritage because he wanted to sell his paintings or whatever. So he's more of a trader.
This medallion is actually one piece of a much larger monument that was built on the corner of this intersection at the foot of Latinska Čuprija, the Latin Bridge. This kind of memorial had no place in the new state, which had seen itself as having been liberated from Austria-Hungary. So having a monument to the murdered Archduke and his wife simply had no place in public space or commemoration. So it was removed and destroyed, with this one piece being preserved. And as far as I know, it has never returned to public space since then. There's this constant movement of memory and dynamics where each regime is basically trying to capture the memory of this incident and re-articulate it in a way that promotes their own ideological understanding. You see a commemorative plaque coming up, for instance, in 1930, and suddenly it's the assassin being glorified. With World War II, when Sarajevo is taken by the Nazis, you see the local Volksdeutsch organization, the local Germans, removing the plaque and sending it to Adolf Hitler on his birthday. With the liberation of Sarajevo, you see another plaque coming up. And this time, again, it's glorifying Princip, but as a kind of proto-partisan. You even have the addition of footprints into the sidewalk, where you're invited to come in and take the position of the assassin, inviting you to take his perspective. And in the 1990s, that plaque becomes, it's torn out, the footprints are destroyed, and again, it becomes a moment where it's not quite clear how this incident would be remembered, whether Princip would be a villain or a hero. It's this very weird movement of temporality, of people in a particular moment telling the story of the past for people in the future. But even then, that story is embedded within its own time period. It's really difficult because you're looking at different pasts of people looking back at this one period, and you never really know how people feel, but you know what the dominant narrative is. So really, I'm looking at this corner to see a much larger perspective. It allows me to talk about diversity, ethnicity, language, nationalism, memory, heritage, legacy, everything.
But what I really like on Revenant is there is so many other places or objects of history which can tell a story, but they are neglected. And this is why I finally, so my first thing was like, oh no, why the Pumarin? I mean, what should I tell about the Pumarin? But I think it's really good because it brings a part of history into life which people don't know.
For me, what is so potently metaphorical about it is that you have this object that is in some sense a material embodiment of the national spirit, and yet the very material from which it is made is something that has this history of inter-imperial violence and warfare, the cannonballs of the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. And so it's the tension between how it might be experienced and understood on the part of Austrians today and that legacy of the inter-imperial warfare and rivalry that I'm finding so fascinating here. It embodies this kind of contradiction, the sort of contradictions that we are attempting to bring out and bring to voice in a way through the Revenant project. And there's something very metaphorical about the fact that it still rings to bring in the new year, to unite the people of Vienna and Austria, and yet it has this latent, unacknowledged history of violence and inter-imperial strife.
Today you hear about the siege regularly, but only in two ways. One is if right-wing politicians want to make a threat out of migration in Vienna by saying it's like, again, like the siege. And the other one is more connected to that lots of migrants from Turkey are now sending their kids to schools in Vienna, and then they open up the history textbook where there is still this portrait of the arch enemy, the Turk. And sometimes then I have a discussion with my students, how did you learn that in school? And I say, first of all, stop using the word Turk. It was the Ottoman Empire. Today's Turks are not related, as we are not Habsburgs or something, or can be made responsible for whatever. You cannot do the same like with the Turkish speakers in Austria today.
You know, in the 1990s, we've been through this. Women with a headscarf were not admitted into university. I mean, it sounds so improbable today, but it was true. And people thought it was a good way to civilize them. You can't get much more Orientalist or colonialist than that. The problem is that anti-Orientalism is as problematic, if not more, than Orientalism itself. Right? I mean, to claim that Osman Hamdi was not Orientalist is, first of all, not to see that he had little choice but to be Orientalist, because that was the logic. Right. That we still are, more or less, we're Osman Hamdi's, especially in intellectual artistic circles and whatever, and that it's okay. I think that Turkey today is doing the same kind of waltz as Osman Hamdi. That is, it's playing the card of Westernization, but selling the Orient, especially in tourism. This is precisely what has fueled Turkey for 2 centuries. This in-between role. Istanbul straddling 2 continents, the bridge over. I mean, you would think that people would be bored of such cliches. No, it still works. And Turkey is still sitting on a fence and benefiting from this. But that's what ensures survival, and that's what gives a lot of flexibility to the system. So maybe it's good.
In each of these cases, we have very clear illustrations of the sort of sensibility and method that Revenant is attempting to bring to all of these different imperial pasts. And indeed, I would hope that it is something that can be applied not only in this region, not only to these empires, but globally in a sense. By examining the impact and the relationship between empires of the past and political life today, we no longer take for granted what political life today is. We destabilize the assumptions about who belongs where, why, how, and what privileges, obligations, and limitations that belonging might entail. However, it can provide different perspectives and at least call into question the assumptions that we make about how the world is arranged and how people are arranged within it. And I think about that every day, and I think that the more that others think about this, the more that we will have the possibility to forge new arrangements for better futures for most, if not all of us. And so I hope that by re-examining these empires, we'll come to understand other ways of forging collective futures that are not only based in the sort of assumptions of nations and states and citizens that we have today.